Hello out there in the world of Meg and anybody else who is listening in for whatever reason. Welcome on board to the MeG Podcast. Been a while since the last one, but as we always say, these things come when we have time to do them. So in this episode, we're going to have a look at Carthaginian armies, which I think it's fair to say are one of the iconic classical era armies, not least because of Hannibal and the Second Punic War, a defining war for Rome and indeed Carthage. Lots of great characters, but Hannibal is probably the one people have generally heard of, along with Scipio Africanus. But we're looking at Hannibal's side this time, but not just the Second Punic War. So we're going to look at the earlier Carthaginian army as well. And you never know, there may just be the odd comment about the post-Second Punic War after Carthage's defeat. But I think we're probably going to stick mainly to the Second Punic War and earlier. I am, as usual, joined by the usual crowd, Richard Jeffrey Cook and Matt Hayward. So hello, chaps.
Good evening.
Hello.
So thank you as ever for joining, and thanks in advance for all the contributions as ever. I thought this time, just for a little bit of difference, before we dive into the main part, I just wondered if we could just see what we've all been doing sort of hobby-wise for the past few weeks since the last podcast. I don't know, Richard?
So last Sunday, I took part in the Kent Clash.
Oh, yeah.
Which was organised by Pete Cross at a private school in Sevenoaks that has a very nice sports centre, and we were up on the top floor, 8 of us playing 3 games, and we were joined in the afternoon by Aid Nash and his son. So that was a 5th game.
Oh, nice.
And the theme was pike and long spear, so all armies had to have 24 pike or long spear, and I took the army of Titus at the siege of Jerusalem, which is 70 AD, and was the last recorded use of a Hellenistic pike phalanx.
I was about to ask, how did you get the required number of pike and or spear into a Roman army?
So you have to do it. You have to take both Commagene and Jewish allies.
Oh, right.
So I had the Commagenes were the people who brought the pike phalanx. So I had 16 pike, and the Jewish provides a unit of 8 long spear. Along with that, I had Praetorian Guard, a veteran legion, a couple of auxiliary and cavalry.
Right.
And I ended up coming second, winning 2 of the 3 games. But we had a very nice time. Facilities were excellent. We had a few families from the school who came and looked at what we were doing.
Oh, right.
And were very interested as well.
Nice.
And all in all, it was a very satisfactory day. Very enjoyable.
Yeah, and I think I've seen something. I think I saw something today which suggested Pete's thinking of running something else there, isn't he? At some point,
I believe he is, and I think if you have the opportunity, I would heartily recommend it.
Well, I was supposed to be taking part in that one, but unfortunately, circumstances were against me. I suppose the fortunate thing on that was that the numbers I think had been uneven before that, and it looked
Indeed.
like Pete might not get any game. So by me dropping out, Pete got to play at the competition he organised, which is always nice.
Yes, so your absence had a positive benefit for Peter, if
the
nothing
competition
else.
benefited from my absence.
And indeed, I did play Peter in the last game.
Oh, great!
So yes, I might have played you instead.
And you would have probably beaten me as usual.
I don't know about the as usual.
Oh, I think you've got a good record against me. I would have taken Carthaginian for by coincidence for this podcast.
Pete actually used the same list I think you had submitted, so
Oh, right.
and I did beat it, so maybe I would have had a chance.
There you are. There you are. So perhaps I dodged one there, but yeah. Okie dokie. Matt, what have you? Because I know you're busy at work. Have you managed to squeeze any hobby stuff in?
I finally, those that know me know I have various health issues that I play on mercilessly with a stick, and do you would be the poor cripple, that kind of thing. But having got my backside thoroughly spanked at Beachhead with an army that I really shouldn't have taken, but I couldn't resist. Doctors reduced my pills, so I was able to paint again, which is the first time I managed to do that since the LGT of last year.
Oh, blimey!
Yeah, so I've literally not picked a paintbrush up since then, and as Beachhead, even though I got beaten, reawakened my interest in a lot of stuff and the hobby side of things. I decided that as we're going to Toil next weekend, I think we're all going, aren't we, to Toil?
Indeed.
Yes, I am going. Yeah, looking forward.
I can ever pick an army.
Well, this was my major problem, and I thought, right, now I'm capable of painting again. I thought I've had this thematic Byzantine army sat in the box, half painted since my DBM days. I think I bought it about 2003. I think I even have the receipts still in the box, from Essex. So I thought, sod that. Half of it's already painted. Well, 2/3. And I thought, you very graciously sent me some general figures that you had lying around because we were talking about that. So I've been cracking on with those, and then once they're done, I've then got a list of things I need to finish off for other people. So yeah, it's been a really fruitful couple of weeks with the paintbrush. So I'm really pleased.
Okay.
I've now got to base everything for Toil, and I guarantee by tomorrow I'll have submitted the list for something else and not take the thematics. But that's besides the point.
So I know between us we did have a bit of a flurry of Byzantine list swapping, thanks to Philip Powell's contribution on the last podcast, wasn't it? His all-mounted 7-tug Nicophorian. Yeah. Because sorry.
No, I was just gonna say I haven't managed to brave the 7 tugs, even though that is my norm. I've actually gone for something slightly larger. But
I think I've seen the list and I like the look of it, but I won't say anything now, obviously. Yeah, and I have to say, after so moving on to my hobby stuff, is one thing I did after the last podcast was buy some Byzantines. I'd previously done the late thematic. I think I might have mentioned this in the last podcast. Decided I was never going to use it, so sold it on to Andy Claxton, who hopefully is finding good use for the figures. They were all Essex, like the ones you've got. But Philip's army so inspired me, I started to buy a later thematic again. So, but I won't be using that at Toil. I suppose. But my other stuff is I've been doing quite a bit of painting. I think, like you, I've been sort of re-inspired to do painting. I'm doing some bits and pieces, really. Just I'm I think like a lot of people, you sort of do an army and buy some bits and options or have spare figures, and I'm trying to get those done before moving on to a whole new army project. So I'm cycling through and finishing off my Yamato Aero Japanese, working on the 28 mils for roll call, and sort of in non-Meg period stuff. I've got some ECW on the way, and although Meg period, not for Meg rules, I've got back into doing the 2mm figures for Strength and Honor, which is a project I started last year, and then it got overtaken by other stuff. So all good stuff. Yeah, it's managed to get plenty of painting done, which is good. And a couple of weekends ago, was at BadCon, using theme here, Carthaginian army, an early Carthaginian army. It was all good fun, and I came 5th. So, which I didn't think was too bad given the army.
So we'll now know what not to do with early Carthaginians, will we?
Well, it has to be said. For this podcast, I am bringing an early Carthaginian army for us to discuss, and it is a tweaked one from the one I used at BadCon. But I thoroughly enjoyed using it. So,
right.
Anyway, enough of that. I think we've all been busy with various bits and pieces, and I say congratulations to Richard for his second place at Peter's competition. But I think let's move on to I suppose what the podcast's here for. This one about Carthaginians, and as ever, Richard is going to kick us off with the historical background about Carthage. So let's see what we learned this week, because I think we always seem to learn something, which is good, and hopefully you, the listeners, do as well. So anyway, enough of me waffling on. Richard, it's over to you.
Thank you, Nick. Okay, so there's quite a lot of history here, so we'll see how we go. So to get to the starting point, Carthage was actually founded in the late 9th century by Phoenicians from Tyre. We're fairly confident about this date because the archaeology has found sort of some of the traces of the earliest Carthaginian remains. So that seems sort of fairly reliable as a date. They sort of quickly established a trading empire which went across Spain, Corsica, Sardinia, Western Sicily, Libya, and extended into Numidia and Mauritania. The Greeks arrived in Sicily in the late 730s, and notably Syracuse was founded by Corinth in 733. And we're going to hear a lot about Sicily and Syracuse in the history. Around 600 BC, Carthage becomes more aggressive and expansionist. This is probably related to the lessening role of Tyre. Due to the actions of the Babylonians and the Persians, Tyre became less significant. It may also be a reaction to the extent of Greek colonization that was going on in the Western Med, in Italy, Sicily, and Massilia, Marseille in France as well. The earliest known military actions date to the 550s. And those were against the Libyans and also in Sicily and Sardinia. The earliest known fleet action is actually from 540 BC, and that was when the Carthaginians were allied with the Etruscans against the Greeks in Corsica. We then know in 515 BC an alliance of the Carthaginians, the Libyan Macae, M-A-C-A-E, might be Marseille, I don't know how that's pronounced, and Leptis Magna, which was another Phoenician colony, actually kicked out a Spartan colony that had been founded under Darius. So that's an example of the Carthaginians and their dominant role amongst the Phoenician colonies that had been established and their contest against the Greeks. We know in 509 they signed a friendship treaty with Rome, and that appears to be the sort of earliest contact between Rome and the Carthaginians. Now, not everything was great for Carthage at this time. We know at some time around this period, the Carthage was actually forced to pay a tribute to the Libyans, presumably buying off an invasion. So it's clear that even at this time, Carthage wasn't getting it all its own way. However, in terms of history, the big event, the earliest event that we have a lot of detail of, is the invasion of Sicily by Hamilcar in 480. The Carthaginians at this time had allied to the Greek city of Selinus, and they were in a war against Gelon, who's the tyrant of Syracuse. The Carthaginians actually were defeated at the Battle of Himera on the northern coast of Sicily, supposedly on the same day that the Greeks defeated the Persians at Salamis. The army of the...
Sounds like a really slightly contrived, that to me, but...
Yes, I think you have to take that with perhaps a pinch of salt. There are suggestions that the Carthaginians actually delayed their invasion to time it with the Persian invasion of Greece, although I think that is I think you can find other reasons why the Carthaginians took a long time to mount their invasion. So I'm not completely convinced by those arguments. Their army was possibly 50 to 60,000. That may be on the large side, but it shows actually how big some of the armies in Sicily could be at this period. And with the defeat, up to half the army was taken as slaves. And as evidence of the numbers, in fact, in Acrogas, which is one of the cities that have been fighting Selinus, some individuals actually obtained 500 slaves. Obviously there were a lot of slaves going, and in fact the temples in Acrogas were some of them built with slave labor from the defeated Carthaginian army. And it's worth bearing in mind that actually Carthaginian armies, even at this period, were made up substantially of mercenaries. So a lot of these slaves would have been actually mercenaries. They were recruited from right around the Western Mediterranean, as well as North Africa. Gelon, having won this battle, actually extracted an indemnity of 2,000 talents from the Carthaginians. And although he didn't invade Western Sicily, it's actually noticeable that after Himera, the Carthaginians actually rapidly expand their colonies outside of Sicily. In fact, for a long period, we don't hear much about Carthage getting involved in outside wars. It seems they focused on expanding and strengthening the areas around their own colonies. The next Carthaginian intervention in Sicily comes actually in 410. So they had stayed out of the Peloponnesian War, but in 410 they aid Segesta, which is another Sicilian Greek city in Sicily. And they actually, in having sent a force in 410, they actually did a full-scale invasion in 409. They actually managed to sack Selinus before it could be relieved, and they followed that up by sacking the city of Himera, getting revenge for the defeat 70 years earlier. There was then a sort of 3-year lull, but a further invasion actually occurred in 406 and 405 BC, where they actually ravaged Sicily right up to the gates of Syracuse. They actually then, during the siege, suffered from plague, where perhaps as much as half of the army died. And because of that, they actually agreed to a treaty where the cities of Selinus, Acrogas, Gela, and Camarina were all to become Carthaginian satellites. The problem, however, for Carthage was this war was that it actually resulted in enduring Greek resentment. And what Carthage actually held, the cities they captured, were really largely shells of their former glory. And the war had left Dionysius in power in Syracuse. and he really started an enduring conflict with Carthage that was actually to continue until his death in 367. In fact, he restarted the war in 398 when he captured the Carthaginian city of Motia, and Motia was never really the same afterwards. Himilco, the Carthaginian general, tried to besiege Syracuse, and he was defeated. And this actually led to a serious revolt by Carthage's Libyan subjects. And that Libyan revolt was never really fully subdued until after 367. In 392, the Carthaginians led another invasion, this time under the Carthaginian general Mago. But this ran out of impetus, and Dionysius was able to negotiate a pretty favourable treaty again. So this was quite a long series of conflicts with a rather unsatisfactory outcome for the Carthaginians. The next major conflict occurs in 341, again a Punic expedition to invade Sicily. This was triggered by the Timoleon, who was a Corinthian who became the tyrant of Syracuse. And the Punic expedition itself was defeated at the Battle of Crimisus, when Timoleon basically ambushes, maybe a strong word, but probably reasonable, a Punic army as it's crossing the river Crimisus, and sort of attacks out of the morning mist. It's the noticeable for the last recorded use of Carthaginian chariots. Anyway, the defeat basically then subsequently leads to again a peace being concluded in 338 BC. The next major war is in 315, and this is after the next Syracusan tyrant, Agathocles, has seized Messene, which the Straits of Messene between Italy and Sicily are named after. And in 311, Agathocles invades the Punic holdings in western Sicily and laid siege to Acragas. So Carthaginian general called Hamilcar leads the response back, where his invasion is successful, and he largely controls all of Sicily and is able to besiege Syracuse. To try and relieve the siege of Syracuse, Agathocles leads a counter-invasion of Africa. And this results in Punic forces being recalled to Africa, where Agathocles wins a victory. He's then joined by 10,000 mercenary Greeks under Apelles that have come from Kyrene, the Greek city in North Africa. And in typical tyrant style, he murders Apelles and takes over their troops. In 308, he returns to Syracuse and defeats the Punic army and lifts the blockade of Syracuse, and then returns to Africa. But in 307, the Carthaginians defeat this Greek army in Africa, and Agathocles abandons his army, which basically falls into the hands of the Carthaginians, who enslave some and recruit others into their army. A treaty dividing Sicily between Punic and Greek domains is then negotiated. This peace lasts until 280, when the Carthaginians seize Akragas, Agrigentum, Syracuse, and Leontini, Greek cities, then appeal to Pyrrhus, who is currently in southern Italy, helping the Tarentines, for help. Pyrrhus then decides to withdraw from Italy and has this idea: I'm going to capture all of Sicily and Carthage and create an Epirot empire south of Italy. And he has some initial success, and he might have actually captured the whole of Sicily, but he gets distracted by a revolt in his rear, and his harsh treatment of his Greek allies and a defeat in a naval battle by the Carthaginians basically leads to Pyrrhus abandoning this idea and returning to Italy, when he, of course, gets famously defeated by the Romans and ends up withdrawing back to Epirus. However, this defeat of Italy has the consequence of bringing the Romans into the theatre of Sicily. So we come in 264 to the First Punic War. This was actually triggered by a group of mercenaries who, after Agathocles had died, had seized the city of Messene. And they are known as the Mamertines. They are an early Campanian army, if you're looking for them in the army lists, by the way. Right. Yeah, they basically, under pressure, appealed to both Rome and Carthage for help. And the Carthaginians basically jump in there and say, yeah, we'll help, and garrison the city of Messene. And this alarms the Romans, who end up siding with the Greeks, and this is essentially what brings Rome and Carthage into conflict in the First Punic War. The First Punic War is actually primarily a naval conflict, most notable for the regularity in which the Romans lose their fleets to storms. In terms of battle, it's a war where both sides get various victories, or defeats, depending on how you're looking at them. In 256, it's notable that Rome invades Africa under the consul Marcus Attilius Regulus. The Romans defeat a Carthaginian army and captured Tunis, which is only 10 miles from the city of Carthage itself. Against this threat, the Carthaginians put their army under the control of a Spartan, Xanthippus, who actually defeats the Romans at the Battle of Tunis. A Roman fleet defeats the Carthaginians and evacuates the survivors, but then that fleet itself is lost in a storm. So you can sort of say that whole conflict was a bit of a 0-0 draw for both sides, really.
I pity the poor Romans who get defeated in battle, think they've escaped, and then probably a lot of them presumably drowned.
Yeah, well, a lot of them were actually allies of the Romans who were manning the warships. So yes, a lot of Italian allies drowned in that particular episode. By 248 BC, it's the Carthaginians actually hold only Lilybaeum and Drepana in the west of Sicily. And after a decisive defeat at the Battle of the Aegetes Islands, which are off the sort of western end of Sicily, the Carthaginians actually sue for peace. Essentially, they're war weary at this time. They've been outlasted by the Romans. And the Treaty of Lutatius essentially leaves Sicily and subsequently Sardinia and Corsica in Roman hands. and the Carthaginians have to pay a large indemnity of 3,200 talents. Now, the end of this war leaves a lot of unemployed mercenaries in Carthage, and the Carthaginians decide they can't pay them and don't want them. And these unemployed mercenaries basically join in with some of the Libyan settlements, and this leads to what is known as the mercenary or the truceless war of 241 to 237 BC. This was a particularly vicious conflict, and it takes 4 years for the Carthaginians to actually suppress this conflict, largely with the help of Numidians who desert the mercenaries and side with Carthage, and then by undermining the rest of the support for the mercenary army. But it gets its name because it was particularly brutal. I think Polybius comments that it was one of the most brutal conflicts in the ancient world. So Carthage now has lost Sicily, and it's at this time that the Barcids, most namely Hamilcar Barca and his sons, which include Hannibal, Hasdrubal, and Mago, build up an empire in Spain to make up for the loss of the territories in Sicily. And eventually a dispute over the city of Saguntum, which is near Valencia in southeast Spain, leads to the conflict of the Second Punic War. I think the basic outline of the Second Punic War is quite well known. Hannibal invades over the Alps and defeats the Romans at Trebia, Lake Trasimene, and Cannae between 218 and 216 BC. And 3 defeats, quite frankly, which would have probably taken any other state out of the conflict. But Rome was not any other state, and it ultimately survives these defeats, and over the years confines Hannibal to the southern portion of Italy. The Romans themselves open up a second front in Spain. In 211 they're badly defeated, but in 207 they gain victories, and Hasdrubal, but they can't prevent Hasdrubal attempting to reinforce Hannibal, and Hasdrubal follows in Hannibal's footprints, sort of marching over the Alps into Italy, but is intercepted by the Romans at the Battle of Metaurus and killed. From this point on, the Carthaginians are on a losing wicket, I think it's fair to say. In 206 BC, the Battle of Ilipa permanently ends the Carthaginian presence in Spain. In 204, Scipio invades Africa, and that leads to the defeat at Zama in 202, and the Carthaginians again suing for peace. The Roman terms this time include an indemnity of 10,000 talents.
Whoa.
And basically Carthage was permanently politically subordinate to Rome. It could not go to war outside of Africa, and it could only declare war in Africa with the permission of the Romans. In 149 BC, the Romans basically found a pretext to declare war, and the Third Punic War results in the sack of Carthage in 146 BC. Famously, the Romans sow salt into the land to prevent Carthage ever being rebuilt. Although the Romans themselves go on to re-establish a colony later, because Africa was too valuable not to. So that is our history of Carthage in a nutshell.
Thank you so much for that, Richard. Thank you especially, I think, for covering the earlier period, especially for the Punic Wars, because I think that's I think it's a period that most of us really know very little about, because the Punic Wars are the headline thing. We've got lots of Roman histories or histories about Rome, so we hear about that. So I think the wars in Sicily especially are it's good to know about them, which leads me to, oh sorry, after you, Richard.
Well, I was going to say I was lucky enough to visit Sicily last October and visited many of the sites, including Akragas, where the temples in the Valley of Temples are stunning. I would thoroughly recommend them, and also saw a raised Carthaginian laburnum that had been sunk probably in the Battle of the Aegites Islands, which is in the museum at Messini, and also got to see Syracuse itself, which obviously has a long history, not only against the Carthaginians, but famously on the Peloponnesian War as well.
Yeah. But one question jumped to my mind when you go to, and relates to Syracuse, actually. It's, when you say during the Peloponnesian Wars, Carthage didn't take the opportunity to get involved. I just wonder if you had any thoughts or read anything about why maybe they didn't join in when the Athenians besieged Syracuse, given that must have been one of their aims, allow them to dominate Sicily entirely.
I think my guess is they weren't prepared. They may not have known, of course, the Athenians intended to invade Syracuse, and also, of course, once the Syracusans have defeated the Athenians, that's you could argue that's not really the most sensible time to then open up a war against Syracuse. But yes, that's what the Carthaginians ended up doing. So yes, it's an interesting question. How much awareness had Carthage of events going on in the rest of the Greek and indeed the Persian world, if you go back to the earlier period as well?
Yeah. Okay. That's it's of course, as you said in your history bit, when the Carthaginians then did go and besiege Syracuse, they suffered in exactly the same way the Athenians did with plague.
Well, I think plague was obviously a big risk to any besieging army in the ancient world. And Syracuse, perhaps with its marshy coastland, may have been more of a danger to besieging armies than other areas. I mean, it's notable if you visit Syracuse, actually, how big the city walls were and how large an area they actually covered, because they extended right up to the top of the heights. So it was, although it was a very long city wall to defend, it was an incredibly difficult place to besiege.
Right. Yeah, it is. Yeah. That's good. As you say, you've seen it firsthand. Yeah. I've got one further question, which, being me, is a sort of list question for you. Because you mentioned at the Battle of Crimsos River, where Timoleon was the last recorded use of chariots by the Carthaginians, but the army list allows them much later than that.
I think
oh, sorry, after you.
I was going to say, I think that's probably because recorded use and when they may have gone out of use could be two different things. And we do know of chariots still being used in North Africa as late as, I think, 275.
Okay.
So I think that may The other alternative may be that the lists are just being far too generous.
Well, as the owner of an early Carthaginian army, and I'll come to shortly when we get onto lists, I'm not complaining because I quite like those chariots. So it just struck me because it's quite a big difference between that date of that battle and the list. Yeah, but we're into the patchiness of the historical record, but we're pretty certain they weren't used in the Punic Wars. So the cut-off date is before that, and not used at the same time as elephants.
Yes, whether the elephants actually were a reaction to replace chariots is certainly a possibility. I've seen that suggested, although whether the elephants would really fulfill a similar role, I don't know.
I suppose it depends how you think the chariots were used. So anyway, again, thank you very much, Richard. That was a great piece of history. Really interesting, and hopefully the listeners will appreciate it. Say especially the amount you put into the pre-Punic War bit, the bit of. Certainly before I looked at anything Carthaginian, I'd never heard of. I think I'll make one last comment I'll make about the Carthaginians, having done some reading on it because I've got the army, is that their generals seem to have, there don't seem to be very much variety in names. They're all Hannibals, Mago, Hamilcars, and so on, and the odd Hanno, and that's it.
Yeah, I think that isn't the reason is that the names derive from Phoenician tradition and relate to particular gods, and there does seem to have been rather a shortage of names. So you do. We're not always sure whether, particularly as you get into the early history, whether the name is the same name for a different general, or whether the histories have merged to two generals who happen to have the same name and conflated the history. So who knows?
Yeah, well, they are. Anyway, enough about you. Yeah, so actually the gods, you got Hannibal, you got Baal at the end, hasn't it? Which is a Middle Eastern god,
one of the Phoenician gods.
Yeah.
And I do have somewhere a book that actually gives the translations of the different names.
There you go. Excellent. Okay, right. Let's go on to army lists then. As I've mentioned a few times, I actually have an early Carthaginian army, which I bought when I decided because I didn't have a classical era army, and apart from my Romans, I wanted an earlier one, fitted more towards the Hellenistic period. Didn't fancy doing a Hellenistic pike army, and so went for early Carthaginian, and have done it entirely in Zeiston figures, which are really nice, and I think paint up really well. Anyway, the list I've got to present to the podcast team tonight, early Carthaginian, pre-Punic Wars. I think it probably fits in. I think I appear to have dated it 406 BCE, so can fit that into one of the campaigns that Richard was just talking about. I suspect it would also work composition-wise for the first Punic War for an army in Sicily, apart from the fact I've got chariots in it, and as we've just been discussing, they wouldn't be around then, but you could replace the chariots with elephants. Anyway, it's I said I quite liked it. I've previously used a slightly different version from this, and I'll touch on that at the end. But to dive into the composition of this early Carthaginian army, all the generals are instinctive. They can't have professional generals in the early Carthaginian army, unlike the later, which we'll come to. I've gone for a talented CNC, 2 competent subgenerals, and a mediocre subgeneral. So I've got 12 cards or discs there. I've got a poor unfortified camp. Haven't failed to find anything to defend that with. The composition of the army, I started with the chariots as mentioned, a unit of 6 of those, formed loose chariots, superior protected, experienced javelin, short spear, devastating charger, melee expert, shoot and charge. I think as a unit I've got more characteristics than most of mine. So in that the just worth noting, the devastating charger and shoot and charge are both optional characteristics, but I've gone for something with a bit of punch. And if you go down that interpretation of the chariots, I suppose what Richard was saying, if the elephants replace the chariots as some sort of, if the chariots were a punch one, that would make sense. I'll just note the list does allow the chariots to be deployed as experienced bow, short spear, melee expert. I've gone for the javelin but devastating charger version, just to be different from the all the Middle Eastern chariots of the Assyrian types. So these are somewhat similar to, and I'd say also to give the army a unit with a good punch with the devastating charger. It's quite an interesting unit because obviously the experienced javelin means they're missile focused, so they don't have force charge. You have to pay for them to charge. So swings and roundabouts on that. But the shoot and charge, although it's only got 2 base width range, can be quite useful on that. My second unit is 6 bases of Campanian cavalry, so some Italians, formed loose cavalry, superior protected, unskilled javelin, short spear. So yeah, they're quite handy, being superior. They've got some combat capability. The unskilled javelin obviously means they can skirmish as well. A last unit of cavalry is Greek cavalry, Greek mercenaries presumably, who are formed loose, average protected, short spear, melee expert. So obviously can't skirmish, but they're and certainly for the period they're reasonably competent in fighting. Not a massive punch, but the melee expert means they stay in there and keep hacking people. The infantry tugs are led by the Sacred Band, drilled close, superior protected, long spear, shove, shield cover. So they're good hoplites basically. The cream of the citizens. 2 units of African spearmen. These are other descriptions of these have been Libby Phoenician or Libyan spearmen in maybe previous army lists, but MeG army list calls them African, which I assume is there to be a bit of a blanket term, so he covers many things and possibly includes some Carthaginian citizens as well. Guesswork from me there. Anyway, they're formed close, average protected, long spear with orb. 2 units, 8 bases each. The orb there, well, that's points left over, and I hadn't got anything else to spend it on. a classic use of orb. So no shove, no shield cover with these. These are, I suppose, not so good hoplites, but perfectly good combat unit. Got a unit of mercenary hoplites, 8 bases, drilled close infantry, average protected, long spear, shove, shield cover. So go with the Sacred Band, but lesser quality. A unit of Spanish. These are tribal loose infantry, average protected, impact weapon, 8 bases. And a unit of Ligurians, because these are compulsory. Again, tribal loose, average protected, experienced javelin, short spear. So both those 2 last units are both tribal, a bit difficult to manoeuvre at times, but can sit in a piece of terrain and be reasonably effective there. We've got 3 SUGs, a unit of Libyan javelin men, 9 bases, poor unprotected skirmishers, experienced javelin, combat shy. A 6 base unit of Balearic slingers, infantry skirmishers, average unprotected, skilled sling, combat shy. So nice little unit for sniping around there. And lastly, a unit of Spanish javelin men, skirmish infantry, average protected, experienced javelin, short spear, shoot and charge. And I have to say that style of troop is rapidly becoming one of my favourite types of skirmisher. I'm finding them really, really useful. So that leaves me with a PBS of 6 and a scouting of 3. With his instinctive generals and not like cavalry, you're not going to get massive numbers there. But the scouting of 3 is quite nice for that style of army. I suppose you say the use, the chariots, the companion cavalry and the sacred band, and indeed to some degree the Greek cavalry, all quite useful melee troops. The African spearmen are somewhat occupy space. They're not terrible, but they're not great, and the long spear can sometimes suffer against other troops if they start losing bases and can't be too deep. They lose their claims there. And I said the Spanish and Ligurians do give you a little bit of terrain capability, but because there's only 2 units, it's more of a sort of occupy and hold while you hope the rest of the army does something. Although I will note that, I think we've mentioned before previous podcasts, that because the Ligurians are experienced javelin and short spear, I think sometimes that experienced javelin is underrated, and I really quite like it. And certainly at the Badcon competition, they were extremely useful for facing off horse archers, especially unprotected flexibles, because that experienced javelin, if they're in loose formation or you get up close to horse archers, will actually be shooting on a green dice, which can ruin a horse archer unit's day quite quickly. I think I hinted before, this is slightly different from the one I used at Badcon, in that I didn't have the devastating charges on the chariots because I'd got 9 bases of Balearic slingers into the army. But I think that was not quite the right choice, and I think the chariots with the dev charger is a better option for this army. So there you are. That's the army. As I said, I quite enjoyed using it. It's not the most rapid army around the field, but it is quite solid. You do really need to close down one flank with terrain as best you can, because it isn't that wide. If it defends, it's only got coastal terrain, so it's one way of helping you get a deep water on one flank. Otherwise, you go and poke people with pointy sticks and try and insert the chariots at some point to get that punch through. And as I said, the companions are being superior are not too bad to support them. So there we are, chaps. I await your thoughts on that list.
So that looks like a pretty standard early Carthaginian army, really. The whole business with the chariots is we have no idea what the Punic chariots look like, and the nearest equivalent we have is probably Phoenician chariots in Cyprus,
right?
Which doesn't help a great deal, which is why you've got the various options. The African spearman, covers a range of Libyan, Libby-Phoenician, Carthaginian, or other mercenary recruits. In the early period in particular, the Carthaginians seem to have used shorter spears than the Greeks. So the long spear classification may be slightly generous at this period, but it certainly doesn't justify the shove that the Greeks get. They, as you say, they can be useful holding up things. My Praetorians had a devil of a job cutting through them at King Clash last weekend, but that was more due to my inability to throw skulls on dice, I suspect, rather than anything else.
I had a similar experience at Warfare last year against Pete Cross, using my 4th century Romans, and he was using early Carthaginian, different, not this version, but I got legions into the African spearmen, thinking, hey, this is good, this is a matchup I want, and a couple of moves later, wondering why my legionaries are running back towards me.
Well, I was using Praetorians, which was particularly upsetting.
Even worse.
There you go. Never mind. But I mean, I think it's an army I've always felt I can't quite put my finger on why it's underpowered, but it always seems to be a little bit. I don't know whether it's because the cavalry don't have quite enough punch, or the foot don't have quite enough punch, or what it is. But that's my experience anyway.
I tend to concur with that. It's got to grind people down. And
it's maybe not a style that I particularly enjoy using. I don't know.
I enjoy using it every now and then, and using it as bad con, I did enjoy it. And Matt, what do you think of this? I suspect it isn't your sort of army.
It's an army I'd probably design, but yes, you're right. It's probably an army I wouldn't enjoy using. Not for any reason other than it's a grind, and I prefer to win big or die quick. So, or just never reach contact with the enemy. I don't know which. I do like the fact that just about everything's in 8s for the foot, so it's not going to be a quick death. So you will grind, and you will grind for a very long time. I like the cavalry. I have to say that's the wing that would probably be what would lose me the game using this army, is I'd spend too much time focusing on the cavalry and not enough time paying attention to what the infantry should be doing, to be perfectly blunt. But no, I like it. It's a piece. It's got me thinking about my Syracusean Greek again, so that will probably come out of the box at some point. So lacking the chariots, but yeah. No,
yeah, sure, it's got something else. Yeah, it is. I think I think it was a feature at the BadCon competition, which the theme for that was really Greeks and Persians. So you say there were a few armies that were quite grindy. I mean, the only Roman in that one was Camillan Roman, which is just long spear for the legionaries, really. So I did fight that. So yeah, a lot of the infantry was grindy. Or in case of the Persians, shooty, or if it was a Persian with Medizing Greek allies, shooty and grindy. So if that makes any sort of sense, I seem to be talking childish all of a sudden. So yeah, just before
Greek to me. Sorry,
can I claim it's Punic?
Oh yeah. We'll go with that excuse.
Yeah. Before we move on to another army, so I said I mentioned I have used a sort of a later version of the early Carthaginian, if that makes sense, because one thing you can get later on in the list, round about 300, is a Numidian ally, which adds a certain something to the list. Basically, in my case, 3 units of skilled shooting javelin light horse. So I would have I fielded that with a unit of the compulsory unit of Numidian nobles, who are just average protected experienced javelin, and then 3 units of average skilled javelin combat shy light horse, all under a talented general. Because I think if you're using that ally, you really want it to play. you don't want it not to. The sort of cavalry that comes with that army isn't quite as good as the one I've just described. You still get the chariots, but I've only ever been able to squeeze a downgraded unit of Campanian cavalry into that one. But I think it's a more mobile version, and the 3 units of skilled Numidian light horse can be very effective, especially against a somewhat less mobile opponent who finds it hard to charge them down. So I think that would, if I had to choose between my 2 versions, I would probably normally take the one with the Numidian, just because I think I'd enjoy using it more, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's the prevailing wisdom, as I know other people who would say that the Carthaginian with the Numidian ally is the favoured option.
Yeah. On the downside, I think it is an obvious option to take.
Yes.
Yeah, but not necessarily a bad thing.
Doesn't necessarily make it any easier to fight.
So yeah, it's quite good. No, as I say, it's enjoyed, and I found making the army, doing it entirely in Zeiston figures, was really, really nice. And just on that, now that they're owned by PSC, we may see them come out in the plastic in the future. Although I suspect that will be quite a long time before they get the full range done, if that's their plan. Don't know if anybody knows anything about that.
Sorry, I don't know.
No, I think they've only just taken it over, haven't they?
Indeed.
So, anyway, we shall move on. And I think we move on to later Carthaginian. And I'm just wondering who to pick on. Richard.
Right.
If that's all right with you.
Yeah, fine by me. So I produced a army of Hasdrubal in Spain, later Carthaginian. So it has a competent professional general, talented professional sub, a Spanish Iberian ally that's a talented instinctive, and a mediocre professional subgeneral. So total of 4, 8, 13 cards, if I've calculated that right.
Yep.
So not unreasonable. I gave it a poor unfortified camp. And it has a PBS of 8 and a scouting of 4, which may give you a clue as to the composition. So it has a veteran Punic cavalry unit, superior protected unskilled javelin short spear. I think that may be the Spanish option for veteran Punic cavalry, as opposed to the Punic option where they don't get the javelins. I had 2 more units of Spanish cavalry, form loose, average protected unskilled javelin short spear. All of the cavalry in 6s. They're supported by 2 units of Numidian cavalry, skirmishers, average unprotected, skilled javelin, combat shy, and a unit of allied Spanish cavalry, which is also average unprotected, skilled javelin. That has the best horse Iberian option as well. So you've got 3 units of decent cavalry supported by 3 units of Numidian and Spanish skilled shooters. So that's quite a powerful cavalry force. And on the infantry side, we've got the African spearmen, form close, average protected, long spear, 2 lots of 8, a unit of Celtiberian Scutarii, who are form flexible, average protected, devastating chargers, a unit of Ligurian foot, who are tribal flexible, average protected, devastating chargers, and then the allied Iberian warriors, 1 unit of noble and followers, who are superior protected impact weapon, 6 of them, and 8 of the average protected impact weapon. Just to finish it off, there's a compulsory unit of allied Catrati, the average protected experienced javelin short spear, and a unit of Balearic slingers, average unprotected skilled sling, combat shy. That all adds up to 9,984 points. Gives you what, 6 files of skilled shooters, no, 8 files of skilled shooters. So a little bit of punch there. A nice option for work round the wings with the cavalry while your infantry hold up the centre. And yeah, follows a sort of basic Carthaginian pattern, I would suggest.
Indeed. That's not bad, Richard. Because I don't know what other people think, but I've always found later Carthaginians seem to have a bit of a reputation of one of those difficult to get a nice army out of lists.
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable army. The 8 PBS for scouting, the strong cavalry force, the infantry are going to pin people down because they're quite reasonable. You've got some quite good capability of fighting in terrain. Yeah, I think there's a lot going for it personally.
Yeah, it's oddly, I was wondering, it's probably not. Would you think it's an army that you're probably going to manoeuvre quite a bit with?
Not sure you are with the infantry. I think because half of the infantry are tribal.
Yeah,
that'll be a tough ask. But I think it's an army where you can do quite a bit with the cavalry.
Yes, I could see. Well, possibly follows the history in that respect. You're likely to win it with the cavalry, aren't you?
It's certainly one approach to winning it. Absolutely, yeah. Yes. Classic envelopment.
Yeah, you said the eight units of 8 files, sorry, of skilled shooters. Very nice. Yeah, so it's yeah, I quite like that. Matt, what do you think of that one?
Well, given I managed to design something very, very similar as my early attempts at a later Carthaginian list for this podcast, I have to say I like it. I really do. I mean, my second approach on the similar list I went more cavalry heavy, and I took a legendary general.
Right.
So it gave you 10-5 on the PBS and the scouting. But,
oh yeah.
I mean, I think in terms of playing style, Richards is more solid. I'd probably get myself into less trouble with it, I think. Well, the one I took, rather than taking the 2 lots of allied foot, I took another unit of Spanish cavalry. So I'm ending up putting 24 Spanish cavalry on the table.
Oh, right.
I lose the Balearic slingers, and I can't remember what else. I used those points. Oh, for the legendary general, that was why that mine is slightly less on the skilled shooting front.
Yeah.
Because I figured 24 Spanish cavalry plus the 3 files of the 3 blocks of light horse give you an absolutely brutal cavalry wing. No, Richards is really nice. It's probably the one that I would prefer to take to a competition because it's slightly more flexible in a sense.
I have a slight worry about the devastating charger infantry.
Yes, I went all with impact weapon. I took all the Spanish Scutari,
right,
rather than go with the death chargers for exactly.
Actually, just for the listeners, we'll make sure that all these lists, including the ones we're not going through any detail, are up on the blog for your perusal. So this variant, this similar one to Richard's that Matt said he came up with, we will get that up there so you can see the differences as well, and have a good ponder yourself if you feel the inclination. Sorry, Matt, I sort of interrupted you with a bit of
no
service announcement there.
No, I pretty much done.
I've got a worry with your list, Matt. I'm not entirely sure
it's legal.
It's legal.
we always have to inform that isn't, don't we?
No, it may well, actually, looking at it, it may well be. Yeah, sorry, that may be me. Is it? No, I'm not sure it's got enough Gauls, but anyway.
Okay,
anyway, we'll take a look afterwards.
Oh, the later Carthage and Hannibal in Italy. You're right. I think it's missing 2.
Okay, we'll come to that in a moment, Matt. So as I say, Richard, I suppose your defence of those 2 units of devastating charger.
Well, I think, yeah, they're going to be quite tricky to hold. So, but the plus point is that they are do give a bit of punch at the impact. So you have to have something there. As I say, I would be probably looking for the infantry to pin an opponent while I'm trying to win it with the cavalry. So I think that's how I would use the army, rather than sort of leading with the infantry, so to speak.
Yeah. So it's a very, very Hannibal approach.
It's an army where I'd really hope to outscout the opponent, because I think it could get into trouble otherwise.
Yes, I think that's a very fair point. Yeah, that said, you'd hope with 4 scouting cards, even if you were out-scouted, you wouldn't be badly out-scouted.
I have to say, if you can get up to the legendary general, then of course that boosts your scouting. I notice in Matt's list he gets 9 PBS and 5 scouting. So that's even stronger. But obviously you pay for that in terms of what you're leaving out of the army as well.
Yeah. So okay, but as I said, that one and the one that listeners will be able to see, this a very similar one that Matt came up with, that wasn't Hannibal in Italy. I think they're really, really strong late Carthaginian ones, and hopefully people out there listening who like myself may have looked at this later Carthaginian list and gone, I can't get a list I like out of it. It will be useful for. However, we've trailed Matt's list a few times. So Matt, since you produced a Hannibal in Italy list.
Indeed, I have just sent you new copies fixing my illegal list, as is the tradition with these things. It was actually a remarkably easy fix, so I didn't have to change much at all. So I've done that. Right.
Brilliant. So once again, we have list development on the fly during the podcast.
So later Carthaginian, Hannibal in Italy. Now I'm calling it Hannibal on a bad day in Italy because I've only taken him as talented. I feel being Hannibal, he really should be legendary, but he got up late, and his wounds was irritating him. So we have a talented professional Hannibal army commander, 2 competent professionals, and a mediocre professional. So giving you a nice round 12 on the cards, which I think is perfectly reasonable.
Good solid number.
Sorry.
Good solid number.
Yeah. The PBS comes out at 9 on the nose, and the scouting comes out at 5. So I'm quite happy with both of those. Total adds up to 9980. So you start with the veteran Spanish cavalry, which are dual loose, superior, protected, unskilled javelin, short spear, shoot and charge. You've then got the 2 normal Spanish cavalry blocks that you can have. So 2 blocks of 6. They're just average, protected, unskilled, javelin, short spear, shoot and charge. 2 blocks of African spearmen in 6s, formed, close, average, protected, long spear. I haven't taken the upgrade option for Italy. It just gets too expensive, and I think that sucks too many points out. Might be a mistake, but there's a way I want to use, though, which I'll talk about in a moment. Then you've got 2 units of Gallic foot, which again I haven't upgraded because I took too few. So now I've used the points to make them, leave them as tribal flexible, average protected, devastating charger, 2 blocks of 9. So that gives you the minimum 18 rather than the 16 I had taken. And then 2 blocks of the Spanish Scutari, which are formed loose, average protected, impact weapon, 2 blocks of 8. Then I guess I do what I usually do. I've now taken 6 units of skirmishers. So awesome. You've got the 2 Numidian cavalry, which are skirmishers, average, unprotected, skilled javelin, not combat shy. The points were there, and I'm like, honestly, having seen Richard use non-combat shy shooting cavalry in such formats, I try not to. If I can get away with not having them as combat shy, I do, because that occasion when it comes useful is pretty critical sometimes. I've then taken the Spanish javelinmen, also going on with something you've been talking about recently about favored skirmishing troop infantry. Mm-hmm. So they're infantry skirmishers, average protected, experienced javelin, short spear. Couldn't afford to shoot and charge on those, but I don't think it's a biggie. So a block of 6 of those. 2 blocks of 6 of the Numidian javelinmen, which are average, unprotected, experienced javelin combat shy, and then a block of 9 poor, unskilled. Basically, because that took me up to the PBS of 9 and the scouting of 5.
Right.
So that's why they got dropped in, because those extra cards I think are pretty useful. So that gives you a total of 15 UGs. So it's a 1/3 deployment of 5. My thoughts on using it is use all the Spanish cavalry on a wing, as we kind of seem to discuss with the Carthaginians. Add in the 2 Numidian cavalry, but I'm thinking I'd use the African spearmen behind the cavalry in 2 wide, 2 blocks of 2 wide, possibly linked by some of the javelinmen, so you can move it as a block. Simply to just break up the cavalry a bit. It makes them a bit of support, I'm thinking, or they push through. The 4 blocks of Gallic, foot, and Spanish are there to control a piece of terrain, because I not want a cluttered table, but I'm thinking I want a reasonably dense table.
Yeah.
With all that skirmishing foot and essentially 4 blocks of formed loose or tribal loose, depending on what you're doing with them, and then try and punch a hole in the flank. And if they're too busy focusing on the cavalry, use the foot to hurt them. So that was the general idea. So let me have it.
Let you have it. Well, you're going to get plus points from me for those Spanish javelinmen, but a minus for only having 6 of them.
Yeah.
I would be tempted with those Spanish javelinmen to make them shoot and charge and take the shoot and charge off one of the Spanish cavalry. It's this question actually because I noticed you've taken shoot and charge with all those Spanish. Richard didn't, and it may be points related, but I think maybe also it's how useful is unskilled shoot and charge.
I think it's very useful against skirmishing cavalry, in the sense that you might get the slow, or if you get close enough, they're unprotected usually, so you're up to wides.
Yeah.
And I also find I'm increasingly coming to I'm throwing 3 black dice against most things, but I'm throwing 3 more black dice before I've even thrown for combat.
Yeah, it's a freebie essentially.
It's a freebie, but it's also, if they've got a general with a unit, if I score a wound on those 3 black dice, he's not going to throw his general in until he's got a unit, until he's lost a base.
Right.
That kind of, there are little things, but you might be right. Looking at the figures, if I took the shoot and charge off of both of them, I might get shoot and charge and a block of 9 Spanish javelin.
Yeah, it's
so
having used 9 in my army bad card, it was great. I loved them. So yeah, so Richard, because just from the other point of view, you didn't take shoot and charge with those Spanish cavalry. Was it a points thing or an effectiveness thing or something else?
I'm not particularly taken with the points effectiveness of unskilled javelin shoot and charge. And to be honest, it was probably a points thing at the end of the day. I'd have to say, occasionally those black dice can come in handy. Again, it depends whether if it was a more sort of open theme where I'm likely to face more sort of shooting cavalry, I might be tempted to take the shoot and charge in those situations. But then I've got the shooting cavalry that can contest those sort of shooting effects. So maybe why the argument is why bother?
Yeah. I think the other thing I'd say about your list, Matt, is this is an obvious one because I've said, coming from me, because I've said it before. The sixes of long spear.
Oh, I totally agree. I wouldn't be looking at them in the front line. As I say, I'd only be looking for them to support the cavalry. There's actually an option you could probably drop the second 6 African and maybe go 8, have 1 block of 8 and maybe look at a cheaper version of the Spanish or the Gallic foot a 6 of those that you could put in the back as a reserve, maybe.
Yeah.
I don't disagree at all.
No, I think it's important that you're seeing them as a support rather than a front line. They're not going to go and pin somebody and go into a grinding melee, like my earlier Carthaginian, where the long spear are going to do a lot of fighting. Yeah, you have a plan for them based on the fact that they're not frontline troops.
Yeah.
So I think that's quite good. Yeah, no, I like this one. And again, I suppose it's going to win through the cavalry, isn't it? In Hannibalistic style.
I think I would be tempted to take an 8 of African spearmen and see if I could have 3 8s of Gallic foot instead, something like that, just to. That might involve tweaking points elsewhere, but it might be a stronger option than going for 2 6s of African spearmen, because they do have the sort of label of "come and get me."
They do. And if we removed all the shoot and charge on our previous conversation, which I'm not necessarily averse to, you probably get enough points there looking at it to do both Nick's suggestion with the Spanish javelin and yours of 3 blocks of 8 Gallic foot. So yeah, totally.
Yeah, I think whatever there's a good core army there, which sort of leads me on to a question, which I think I've hinted at previously, is that I think people have seen this late Carthaginian as difficult to get a workable army from. I was wondering if the reality is people are looking at Hannibal, and why not? Hannibal is iconic, and then they're looking at the list options for Hannibal in Africa, or in Italy, or indeed Africa, and they want to get those toys, the upgraded African spearmen to superior long spear, shove shield cover. Maybe using Hannibal in Italy can have some companion foot who are impact weapon shield cover melee experts. They're average legionaries, but that still pushes the cost up a bit. Whether actually that's oddly a bit of a trap.
I think it definitely can be, yeah.
Because I know I've had a bit of discussion about it a year or so back with Paul Stovall, who I think creates good army lists, and I think he just gave up on it. But I think he was kind of looking at the Hannibal in Italy or possibly Hannibal in Africa options.
I think there's an argument to say that Hannibal's strength was in the fact that he took a lot of what in MeG terms is cheap troops with a small strike force. If you try and go for all the good African stuff and the high grade cavalry, you just don't have enough to fight the battle, I think. So swings and roundabouts. I mean,
and it's worth pointing out, of course, that the Hannibal in Africa option is a losing option, whereas the Hannibal pre 216 was actually a winning option.
This is a good point. Yes, yeah. Actually, that is a very good point. All those Hannibal with toys, apart from Cannae, his great victories are behind him. So perhaps that explains it all. Perhaps we're looking at it wrong, or perhaps I've been looking at it wrong, thinking Hannibal. Because actually, I think I know in that last tweak you just made on that list, you dropped the Gauls from form flexible, which they're allowed, Hannibal in Italy, back down to tribal.
Yeah.
And I suspect for what you're going to use them as, tribal doesn't matter. In fact, having them in 9s is probably better than having them in 8s. That extra half base, the wound to break them could be really important.
Yep, absolutely. Having made the change, I was quite happy with it. By instinct, I thought, they need to be formed because that makes them better. I don't think it does in this list, and I think you're right. Actually, I've just sent you Mark 3 of this list, where I've now taken 3 blocks of 8, dropped the African down to a single block of 8, and got the shoot and charge on the Spanish javelin. So there.
I just worked that out as well. Yes.
So
2 changes.
3 versions of one list, and the thing, of course, up till this point the listeners haven't realised is that you've actually developed all three versions whilst we've been doing the podcast, because your initial offering was so similar to Richard's. We decided we couldn't go with two very, very similar armies. And again, listeners, look on the blog, you'll see how similar they are. So thank you, obviously, thank you to Matt for beavering away.
Well, it just goes to prove the point that I actually write my best army lists under stress 5 minutes before they're needed. I shouldn't think about these things before the deadline. I really shouldn't.
I seem to remember it was about a year ago. One list I brought to a podcast is one I sort of knocked up as, I'll do another one in 15 minutes. And everybody went, "Ooh, that's rather good, isn't it?" Yeah, so there's overthinking. It's, if you get a list that works, go with it. Definitely don't overthink it. So
this is going to be my strategy for toil. I've so far composed 8 early medieval lists for time of inadequate lighting, the Dark Ages competition. I'm working on the principle that if I can produce an army list for every army that's a valid choice, I can then randomly choose one of those to take, because I have no idea how I'm going to pick any other way.
Yeah.
I think I've created more versions than the thematics had emperors.
They had quite a few.
Yes. I've had to start trimming my folder of Excel spreadsheets.
I've been blessed that I'm, although I haven't submitted it yet, so there's always that last minute change of mind that I will be going with the Bedouin that appeared on the last podcast, wasn't it? About Nicophorian Byzantines. So there you are. People should know what my army is going to be. So, because again, partly because the audience, yourselves and Philip and Jamie, all said, "Oh, that's rather good," or indeed, I wouldn't like to face it in some cases.
That, yeah. Famous last words.
Yeah. So you might all be suckering me in on that one, but we shall see. So I think, and I hope our listeners will benefit from it, that we may have come up between us, or mainly, well, yourselves, Richard and Matt, with late Carthaginians that are basically workable and could be effective.
I think they always blame us if they don't. And we can just say it's the genius of the general. It's not the army, it's the genius of the general.
And because of that, just as a reward for Richard, I'm going to throw in a question that I was asked. I think it might have been Paul Stovall, since he just had, with the Gallic foot basically in the Hannibal in Italy option. Might there be an argument that they wouldn't be that devastating charger and some other classification would be more appropriate to long service Gauls?
I
didn't have an answer because it's really not my period or anything. So.
Short spear melee expert option?
I think that's what he was fishing for.
I'd just go with formed flex melee expert. Means they get battered in the impact but stand, which is what Hannibal seemed to use them for, to hold a center, and they die slowly. At the moment, they shatter or don't, and then die quickly in the melee. So is the reverse actually better?
Yeah, I mean, at Cannae, Hannibal mixes his Spaniards and Gauls together, doesn't he? Which suggests they can fight together, which mixing impact weapon with devastating charger doesn't really suggest works so well. So maybe there's an argument that says you should upgrade Gallic and Spanish foot to perhaps a form flexible average protected impact weapon type option.
Make them the same, or I did. something nice about having them different, though, isn't there? Just on that variety thing. And I was wondering about Matt's idea. You know, they'd be like formed and just melee expert. If you didn't want to give them short spear as well.
Yeah.
You'd certainly get more for your points.
Yeah.
If you don't give them.
Yeah.
Don't know. I'm not saying it's the right thing. It's just that it just feels more solid to me. Which kind of is the impression I get, which may be wrong, that they formed more of a solid core than a land type, barbarian charge. But who knows?
Well, I think there is a bit of the devastating charger buys into the Roman narrative of barbarians, doesn't it? And I'm not sure it's entirely sustained, even by that quite a number of Caesar's accounts seem to indicate a certain solidity. I think I have seen it suggested by somebody. Are we actually wargaming the Roman propaganda view of barbarians rather than the history?
Well, you've got to figure, if you tried to refight Cannae, would a Gallic center hold long enough for him to envelop the wings? Because
well, that's when you need a legendary general using all the cards to recover wounds and so on.
Well, I guess that's true. Yes, not leading his cavalry.
Yeah, and you have to remember, you have to grade the Roman infantry correctly as well.
Yes, that is true.
It's there's two sides to it. Maybe it's an argument that at Cannae, some of those legionaries aren't even impact weapon, or certain probably, or not melee experts, and definitely not superior.
This is true. Yes, very true.
Indeed. I mean, I think when we discussed Cannae in one of Simon's broadcasts, that I think the prevailing view was that a lot of the legionaries would be just an average impact weapon without melee expert.
Yeah, and you would inevitably end up with far more of a grind that way, wouldn't
you?
Yeah.
So it's anyway, maybe something to think about. If it was Paul who raised that one, maybe not just for Cannae, because I mean, I do remember. I think it was when Phil Barker was developing DBMM, as he tried to get classifications to reflect the battle. They were going through all sorts of permutations and strange ideas. And you've got to remember that Cannae is just one battle, and every battle is unique.
Yeah, I think Blade Eye appears somewhere in the DBMM list for barbarians, I seem to remember. But for those who don't follow DBMM, apologies.
Yes, I was mainly referring to just as you can get really tied up on, especially an iconic battle like Cannae, and in a set of rules that is trying to cover a very wide range of actions and time period. Maybe sometime you have to go, I know it's iconic, but it really is an edge case.
Yeah, I'm just thinking of the amount of effort involved in regrading all barbarians to not be Dev Charger. That could be a lot of lists.
Yeah, no,
but I have to say, I mean, I did seriously consider an option for Gauls, for example, to be something like short spear, unskilled javelin, rather than Dev Charger.
Yeah, well, you did change the Goths to that many years ago, didn't you? I think very early lists in MeG, the Goths in the 4th century, 3rd, 4th century Goths were Dev Charger because they were just warband, and now they are javelin and short spear. And then as they get Roman equipment, they can also pick up melee expert because they're a bit different. But yeah. It's but I think we probably don't want to change them all. Otherwise, we need to keep a certain amount of variety. And if we are playing the
I think it would be it'd probably be an all or none option.
Yeah. Well, there we are.
Like we did for Thuriofera.
Yes, exactly. That might set some hairs running anyway. They're going to change everything. So perhaps we'll throw in the usual caveat at this point. If a change were to be made, it would certainly be an all or none, and it wouldn't mean you had to throw away all the figures you've got. Whatever it was, the figures would still be usable, perfectly legitimate to use, because they're still going to be Gauls. So, okay, after a quick attempt at scaring anybody who owns a Gallic army with that, I think perhaps we've come to the end of that. So anyway, as I said before, thanks guys. I think those late Carthaginian ones especially have hopefully been really valuable. They have been for my thinking about that army. Just to reiterate, obviously all these lists will be up on the blog when you're listening to this podcast, you'll be able to look at them. Also on that, we will have a listing of some historical sources, people like Polybius Livy and so on. Some modern books you can buy. There are a number of Osprey books that cover it, inevitably. So many people will already have them. Some other more in-depth, more not necessarily academic, but I think one of them is quite academic, I'll put on that, but certainly readable, including a couple of volumes on that entitled The Tyrants of Syracuse, because going back to Richard's history, all that history around fighting in Sicily or whatever, will be referenced in those as well. So broaden horizons, and some suggestions of where you can get figures from. Now, obviously, there's quite a lot of people who do figures, so a reasonably long list there. But I doubt it's exhaustive. But hopefully, it would help anybody who's looking forward. And it even includes a couple of 3D printing STL file sellers I found when looking for Carthaginians. So the people who are looking to 3D print stuff, something there. See, we're catching up with the modern world. Yeah, I can hear Graham Clark already saying, yeah, I've already got them all. I bought into the Kickstarter. He may even have printed some of them out. So, okay, guys, I think we've spent a reasonable amount chatting. So maybe I think it's time just to wrap this one up.
I've just
sorry, Matt. Yeah.
No, I've just got one last thing that I wanted to say. I was sorry to hear that Ian Heath had passed away. For those who have used his books, particularly the WRG, like the Armies of the Dark Ages, which I'm actually holding in my hand at the moment because I've been using it for my thematics. Yes, I was very sorry to hear that. He has enriched my hobby greatly over the years. So I just thought I'd mention it.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, well said. Yeah, and I agree with that. And in fact, that particular volume will be particularly useful to you because I'm pretty sure that Essex based their figures on his illustrations.
Yeah, they did indeed.
So yeah, no, I think he contributed massively to the hobby. I think I have all the Ian Heath volumes, and he also did some for Foundry, didn't he? There were some hardback ones he did as well, which certainly one that covers things like the Tudors. It was a 16th century volume, I think. So outside of Meg, but again, a very useful volume. Yeah, he's so thank you for mentioning that, Matt. Definitely, I think a lot of people were very, very sad to hear his passing. So I think looking forward, there are, I think we mentioned already, there's some obviously comps upcoming. Toil is one, Time of Insufficient Light, because we don't use the term Dark Ages these days. Or early medieval, I think Richard used. That's on 18th and 19th of March in Derby. I suspect when you, the listener, are listening to this, it'll be about the time lists are supposed to be submitted, but there may still be places if you're interested in that one. On the 25th and 26th of March at Battlefield Hobbies, there's 2 days of Pacto gaming, run by Simon Hall. And I think that is as much come along and find out what it's all about. Introductory, new players who want to find out about MeG through the smaller version of the game, most welcome. I expect there will be some more experienced players on hand to help people through.
I will be there.
There's a fair chance I'll be there at least one of the days. I'm not sure I can make both at the moment, but we shall see. So, and armies will be available to be lent for that. So if you're interested in MeG, or you know somebody who's interested in MeG, if you're one of our regulars, it could be an opportunity for people to come and try before you buy. Have a loan army, play a few games of Pacto, talk to the author, talk to the some of the regulars, and find out what it's all about.
You never know, there may even be a sneak preview of the new Pacto rulebook online. That's no promise on that, but it may be. We're reaching that stage.
Excellent. Oh, thank you for that, Richard. Of course you do. And the week after that, it's roll call in Cranfield, 1st and 2nd of April. That's our first UK 28mm Magna 2-day competition, I believe. Apologies if anybody else has run one and I've forgotten about it. There we are. So we're looking forward to playing with big toys on that one, and I need to finish painting my army for that. Otherwise, I'm going to look very, very foolish. One of the MeG event I'd just like to flag as well at this point. It's later in April, on the 29th of April, up in the northeast, at the, I think it's the Pendraken store. There's a one-day MeG intro event being run by the Little Corporal, the guy who runs Little Corporal, whose name I can't remember. Is it Richard? Is he another Richard?
I'm afraid I can't remember.
Oh, we're all blanking on it. Apologies to him. Apologies to him. But yeah, so again, maybe people up in the northeast, northwest, or if you know people up there who are interested, they can go along to that. And again, a bit like the one at Battlefield Hobbies, have a look, find out what MeG is all about. And of course, Little Corporal also sell Lurkio figures. So I'm sure if you get into it at that event, he'll be very interested in selling you some, as of course would Pendraken with their 10mm figures. So there we are. Don't know if either of you, Richard or Matt, have got anything else you wish to add at this point?
For anybody who has been waiting to order the print-on-demand version, apologies, we hit a technical issue. That is currently, I think, resolved, and hopefully we will be able to start reoffering the print-on-demand version fairly shortly.
Thank you for that, Richard. Anything from you, Matt?
Richard just preempted me. Actually, it was a question I had for him, and he's already answered it. So that's
excellent. Okay, well, I think it's finished for saying, as ever, both of Richard and Matt, thank you so much for your contributions. Thank you to listeners for listening to this. We always welcome feedback, and as I remember, all the supporting information is on the blog. The URL will be posted wherever you've seen the link to this podcast. So until the next time, thank you and good night.
Thank you both. Yes, enjoyable as always.
Oh, thank you, guys. Thank you, Richard, for that history.